The world for Albert Einstein was a system of elegant, if often hidden, equations. Yet in the spring of 1933, the variables of human behavior were solving for chaos. From his temporary sanctuary in Belgium, he watched the elegant order of his theoretical universe fracture against the crude, violent geometry of rising power. Brownshirts marched in lockstep, their boots pounding a rhythm of hatred that drowned out the quiet hum of reason. Newspapers he had read for decades now screamed with grotesque caricatures, his own face, the wild halo of hair, the gentle, weary eyes transformed into a venomous icon of treachery. The system he studied now was not of light and gravity, but of fear and force, and its laws were proving terrifyingly simple. He moved through those days with a physicist's calm, a deep, still center within the political storm. While colleagues scrambled and institutions crumbled, Einstein observed. His was not the detachment of indifference, but the intense focus of a diagnostician examining a feverish patient. He had always been a student of systems, and humanity, in its mass formations, was perhaps the most complex and perilous system of all. The same mind that visualized riding a beam of light now traced the predictable arcs of propaganda, the gravitational pull of scapegoats, the critical mass required for a society to ignite. He packed a few belongings, his notes, a violin. The act was quiet, methodical. The photograph of his departure, captured in grainy black and white, shows a man not in flight, but in deliberate, sorrowful transit, his gaze already fixed on a horizon of gathering shadows. That archival footage, flickering and stark, cuts abruptly to the shimmering, hyperreal present. The monochrome columns of marching men dissolve into a riot of pixelated flags on a massive digital screen at a political rally, faces in the crowd contorted by the same fervor, lit by the glow of smartphones instead of torchlight. The silent, newsreel shots of burning books find their echo in the torrential scroll of incendiary posts, virtual pyres consuming shared truth. Einstein's journey from a Berlin train station is mirrored in the modern exodus of journalists, scientists, and dissidents from new autocracies, their departures live-streamed, their persecutions algorithmically amplified. Through this juxtaposition, Einstein emerges not as a relic of a bygone crisis, but as the first observer of a recurring condition. He witnessed the moment when the delicate apparatus of civil society, the free press, the independent judiciary, the sanctity of rational debate, was identified not as infrastructure to be maintained, but as obstruction to be dismantled. He saw how language was weaponized, how Volk and Fatherland became incantations to short-circuit individual thought. His calm was the calm of comprehension, the dreadful understanding that the chaos was not an aberration, but a phase state, a configuration that human systems, under specific pressures of fear and grievance, could reliably assume. He left Germany, but he took with him a new set of observations, data points on the pathology of the herd, the first notes for a warning he would spend the rest of his life articulating. The turbulent times were not his backdrop, they were his laboratory, and the experiment was running its grim, predictable course. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by the silent testimony of books and papers, Einstein began to codify his observations. The phenomenon he dissected was not new, but his perspective was uniquely systemic. He termed it the herd mind, a psychological state where individual reason, that precious and hard-won spark, dims and is subsumed by the collective glow of the mass. It was not a metaphor but a mechanics, a describable process as real as thermodynamics. He saw it not as a descent into madness, but a transition into a different, simpler state of being, where the complex calculus of individual conscience is replaced by the binary arithmetic of us and them. The mechanism was deceptively straightforward. In isolation, a person weighs evidence, entertains doubt, and navigates the world through a web of personal ethics and reasoned conclusions. But introduce the catalyst of fear, economic desperation, existential threat, manufactured crisis, and the individual seeks refuge in the solidity of the crowd. The weight of personal responsibility lifts. The dizzying freedom of independent thought is exchanged for the comforting certainty of the collective will. In the herd, one does not need to think, one only needs to feel and to follow. Einstein watched this transformation sweep through his own country with clinical horror. The nuanced citizen, capable of skepticism and subtlety, vanished, replaced by the chanting acolyte whose identity was now forged in the furnace of shared grievance. The visual parallels between that historical moment and our own are etched not in stone but in light. The monolithic rallies of the 1930s, vast seas of identical uniforms and upraised arms, find their spectral reflection in the digital arenas of today. Then the spectacle was centralized, a single stage amplifying a single message to a captive, physical audience. Now the rally is fragmented and omnipresent, playing out on millions of screens. The synchronized chant is replaced by the cascading like, the viral hashtag, the emoji storm of outrage or adoration. The The same psychological surrender occurs, but the herd is virtual, its borders defined by algorithmically reinforced feeds rather than city squares. The individual scrolling in solitude is paradoxically never alone, perpetually bathed in the validating glow of curated consensus, their reason slowly eroded by the endless affirming stream. At the core of this mechanics, Einstein identified fear as the primary catalyst, the essential reagent that triggers the reaction. It is fear that makes the simplification of the herd mind so attractive. Faced with a complex, threatening world, the herd offers a clear enemy and a simpler story. The frightening chaos of global markets, technological disruption, or social change is distilled into the face of a scapegoat or the promise of a strongman's control. Einstein saw how this primal emotion was expertly harvested, how economic anxiety was alchemized into racial hatred, how national humiliation was weaponized into expansionist fury. This fear, once ignited, becomes self-perpetuating, burning away the connective tissue of empathy and shared humanity, leaving only the hardened, combustible material of tribal loyalty. The herd, bound by this shared fear, moves as one organism, its direction dictated not by the reasoned deliberation of its members, but by the momentum of its own panic and the will of those who channel it. The consequences of this psychological transition were, to Einstein, both predictable and devastating. Once the herd mind cohered, its logic became internally consistent yet utterly detached from external reality. The first casualty was independent judgment, replaced by a blind, devotional loyalty to symbols and leaders. Einstein observed with profound disdain how the complex tapestry of a nation, its culture, its history, its people, could be reduced to a fetishized emblem, a flag waved not as a symbol of shared endeavor, but as a totem against the other. He saw individuals surrender their moral compass to the magnetic north of a leader's will, their applause and adulation becoming a form of intellectual abdication. The leader ceased to be a fallible public servant and became a priest of the tribe, his pronouncements unimpeachable dogma, his persona a screen upon which the herd projected its own salvific fantasies. This devotion necessitated a corollary, the active rejection of expertise and the erosion of institutional trust. If the leader's word was truth, then any competing claim was heresy. Einstein, whose life was a testament to the painstaking, collaborative project of building knowledge, watched in anguish as the edifice of learned authority was deliberately vandalized. Scientists, historians, judges, and journalists were recast not as guardians of specialized understanding, but as enemies of the people, members of a conspiratorial elite intent on obscuring the real truth, a simpler, more satisfying narrative curated by the herd's shepherds. He recognized this as more than political strategy, it was a narcotic. Nationalism in this virulent form was an infantile disease, an intellectual narcotic that dulled the pain of complexity with the euphoria of belonging and the rush of shared grievance. It made the world feel manageable by making it smaller, defined solely by the perimeter of the tribe. The modern manifestations of this pattern are etched in our daily discourse. The conspiracy theory is its purest epistemological product, a closed system of belief, immune to evidence, that explains a complicated world through the machinations of a hidden, malevolent cabal. It flatters the believer with the illusion of secret insight while absolving them of the hard work of understanding systemic causes. This mirrors perfectly the rejection of expertise Einstein documented. The erosion of institutional trust is now ambient, a low-grade fever in the body politic. Centuries-old pillars of civic life, the press, the academy, the courts, are persistently framed not as flawed but essential mechanisms for accountability and discovery, but as partisan actors in a grand, zero-sum game. This distrust is not an accident. It is a cultivated condition, a fertilizer for the herd mind to grow. When no arbiter of fact is considered legitimate, the only currency left is tribal affiliation, and the loudest, most emotionally resonant voice wins. Einstein's warning, therefore, was not merely about the dangers of a specific ideology, but about this fundamental shift in how a society processes reality. The herd mind creates a parallel epistemological universe, one where loyalty trumps accuracy, where feeling certitude replaces the pursuit of verification. It is a world where the shared commons of fact fractures into a landscape of isolated, mutually hostile encampments, each armed with its own self-reinforcing narratives. The tragedy he foresaw was not just political violence, but the deeper, quieter violence done to truth itself, the collective agreement that some things are so, regardless of what one wishes to believe. Once that agreement is shattered, the very groundwork for reasoned debate, for compromise, for a shared future dissolves. What remains is the mechanics of the herd, moving in its terrible, simplistic rhythm, a monument not to collective strength but to the individual's surrendered light. The mushroom cloud over the New Mexico desert was more than a weapon, it was a verdict. For Albert Einstein, whose letter to President Roosevelt had helped initiate the Manhattan Project. The blinding flash at Trinity site illuminated a terrifying equation he had long feared. Technological capability was accelerating at a rate that utterly dwarfed humanity's moral and political maturation. The power to split the atom had been unlocked by a handful of minds in a few short years. The wisdom to manage such power, to embed it within a framework that prevented species suicide, remained a primitive, fractured aspiration. The bomb was the ultimate expression of an unchecked tool, a creation of exquisite scientific brilliance that delivered not enlightenment, but the cold mechanics of annihilation. It proved that humanity could master the cosmos without mastering itself. Einstein spent his post-war years issuing a warning that extended far beyond nuclear arsenals. He saw the bomb not as an endpoint, but as a precedent, a stark demonstration of a recurring pattern where a tool's destructive or destabilizing potential is realized only after it is already woven into the fabric of civilization. The same pattern, he feared, would replicate wherever ingenuity outpaced wisdom. The line he drew from Los Alamos did not end in the missile silos of the Cold War. It extended, prophetically, into the very architecture of modern life, into the silicon chips and fiber optic cables that would come to bind the world. The information age, with its promise of global connection and democratized knowledge, carried within it the same latent peril, a tool of immense social power, developed and deployed without a concurrent evolution in the societal immune systems needed to govern its use. Nowhere is this legacy more evident than in the evolution of propaganda. The crude, monolithic tools Einstein witnessed, the state-controlled radio, the party newspaper, the mass rally, were blunt instruments. They shouted a single message at a captive audience, relying on volume and repetition to overwhelm dissent. Their modern successors are not blunt but bespoke. They operate in whispers. The algorithms that curate our digital lives are engines of personalization, studying the intimate contours of fear, desire, and identity to serve a propaganda that feels not like coercion, but like affirmation. Where Joseph Goebbels sought to create a single, unified Reichsradio listener, the new architectures seek to create billions of unique, isolated realities. The tool is no longer a megaphone. It is a mirror, reflecting back at each user a version of the world that confirms their biases, amplifies their grievances, and deepens their tribal affiliations. The manipulation is seamless, invisible, and devastatingly effective. This leads to the central paradox of our connected age, a world of unprecedented linkage fostering profound fragmentation. The very tools designed to bridge continents and cultures have become the primary engines of societal schism. We are connected, yet we inhabit non-overlapping epistemic universes. We can communicate instantaneously with anyone on the planet. Yet we increasingly lack a shared language of fact or a common narrative of reality. The global village has splintered into a digital archipelago of isolated islands, each with its own climate of belief, its own version of events, its own sacred truths and designated heretics. The herd mind, which once required physical proximity in a square, can now form and intensify across vast distances, bound by digital signals rather than shared space, its passions amplified by networks that profit from engagement, regardless of its corrosive nature. Einstein's warning about the unchecked tool is thus a warning about velocity. The speed of innovation in how we communicate, persuade, and organize has created a permanent gap between what we can do and what we should do. The nuclear age introduced a physical deadline for developing political wisdom. The information age presents a subtler, more insidious deadline for developing cognitive and social resilience. We have built a system that can deconstruct a shared reality with terrifying efficiency, but we have not built the civic, educational, or psychological frameworks to reassemble one. The tool is here, humming in our pockets and shaping our perceptions. The wisdom, the collective will to understand its mechanics, to mitigate its harms, to subordinate its power to humanistic ends, remains, as it did in the shadow of the first atomic fireball, a distant, urgent, and unfinished project. The unchecked tool defines our epoch not through a single, apocalyptic flash, but through a million daily fractures in the bedrock of common understanding. For Albert Einstein, the only conceivable answer to the centrifugal forces of nationalism and the herd mind was a framework of shared sovereignty, a supranational authority. This was not a dream of world government for its own sake, but a logical necessity born of his systemic view. Just as gravity required a universal constant, human survival on a planet armed with existential technologies required a universal covenant. This authority would be vested not in a single power, but in the collective guardianship of agreed-upon laws and, more fundamentally, agreed-upon facts. Its bedrock would be a common factual ground, a shared reality meticulously cultivated and fiercely protected as the essential soil in which rational discourse and peaceful coexistence could grow. He imagined a global commons of truth, maintained by independent institutions and a free press, where disputes would be settled by evidence and arbitration, not by the brute force of propaganda or arms. That commons has now been subdivided, paved over, and built upon with impenetrable walls. The modern landscape is one of radical epistemological privatization. Where Einstein envisioned a shared park of public knowledge, we now have a sprawling subdivision of gated informational communities, each with its own curated lawn of facts, its own security force of pundits policing the boundaries, and its own strictly enforced covenants on what constitutes reality. The visuals of this collapse are both stark and intimate. On one screen, a news anchor speaks calmly about climate data from a studio backdrop of melting glaciers. On another, a charismatic host gestures before a chart of cherry-picked numbers, dismissing the same data as a hoax. In adjacent living rooms, bathed in the glow of different devices, citizens consume not just different opinions, but entirely different worlds. The media bubbles are not merely partisan echo chambers. They are self-contained universes with their own physics, their own histories, their own sets of undeniable truths. This fragmentation manifests most destructively in the theater of politics, which has ceased to resemble a shared project and instead operates as a form of tribal warfare. Debates are no longer contests of ideas within an agreed-upon arena of facts. They are clashes of mutually exclusive narratives, where the very legitimacy of the opponent's starting point is denied. A policy discussion cannot proceed when one side's foundational data is considered by the other to be a malicious fabrication. The feeling is no longer one of disagreement within a common enterprise, but of alienation from a process that seems to operate in a foreign language. Politics becomes performance for one's own tribe, a ritual of affirmation rather than a mechanism for collective problem-solving. The notion of a loyal opposition, essential to Einstein's vision of a healthy polity, becomes an oxymoron. Opposition is framed as treason, and loyalty is measured by adherence to the tribe's narrative, not the nation's constitution. The profound consequence is a paralysis of public purpose. When a society lacks a common factual ground, it cannot diagnose its problems, much less agree on solutions. A public health crisis becomes a referendum on trust. An economic downturn fractures into a dozen conspiracy theories, the infrastructure of shared reality. The census, the peer-reviewed study, the judicial finding, is weakened, its readings contested the moment they contradict tribal identity. This erosion creates a vacuum where emotion and identity rush in, filling the space where reasoned deliberation once stood. The shared project of citizenship devolves into a zero-sum competition for cultural dominance, where winning the story is more urgent than solving the problem. Einstein's supranational authority was meant to be a bulwark against this very entropy, a structure to uphold the commons against the encroaching tides of tribal solipsism. Its modern absence is not a passive condition but an active unraveling, leaving behind a polarized landscape where we are, increasingly, not just arguing over what to do, but arguing over what is, inhabitants of different planets orbiting the same, increasingly neglected world. Einstein was not a prophet. He offered no timeline, named no specific demagogue, predicted no exact date of societal fracture. His genius lay not in clairvoyance but in pattern recognition. From the chaos of his century, he extracted the recurring algorithm of human regression, the fundamental equations that describe how enlightenment retreats before fear, how reason is supplanted by tribal instinct, how tools of immense power outpace the wisdom to wield them. He identified not a single event, but a phase, a dangerous but repeatable state into which complex societies under sufficient stress can reliably collapse. His writings are not a forecast for our time. They are a diagnostic manual, and the symptoms he cataloged are now in acute presentation. A slow montage of his words, rendered in his own modest handwriting, overlays contemporary scenes of discord. The quote, "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it," fades in over footage of a crowded subway car where every passenger is staring, isolated and silent at their own glowing screen. Nationalism is an infantile disease, appears superimposed on a massive, rippling flag at a stadium rally, the faces beneath it a blur of ecstatic uniformity. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, lingers over a server farm, its endless blinking lights representing the incomprehensible data flows that shape modern thought. The difference between genius and stupidity is that genius has its limits, hangs in the air as a televised debate devolves into simultaneous, incoherent shouting. The juxtaposition is not heavy-handed, it is eerie. His calm, precise phrases act as a sober narration for our frantic imagery, revealing the underlying structure beneath the noise. This synthesis reveals the core of his perceived prophecy. It was always an observation of mechanics. The herd mind is the psychological engine. The unchecked tool is the accelerant. The erosion of the commons is the inevitable environmental degradation. Each chapter of his warning interlocks with the next, forming a coherent sequence of societal failure. He saw how economic anxiety and existential fear, once skillfully harvested, could trigger the mass surrender of individual critical thought. He understood that this surrendered populace would then be uniquely vulnerable to the narcotic of simplistic narratives and strongman worship. He foresaw that the technological tools of the age, whether atomic or digital, would be wielded by this regressed collective consciousness, amplifying its worst impulses without the mediating wisdom of a mature, critical citizenry. And he predicted that the final stage would be the dissolution of the shared factual and ethical ground necessary for any collective recovery, trapping the society in a self-reinforcing cycle of fragmentation and hostility. Therefore, his legacy is not a dire prediction of inevitability, but a clarion call to vigilance directed at the only counterweights he ever truly believed in: reason and education. Against the gravitational pull of the herd, he posited the cultivated strength of the individual mind. Against the seductive simplicity of tribal dogma, he championed the complex, demanding pursuit of objective truth. His faith was not in institutions alone, but in the human capacity for independent thought that those institutions must nourish and protect. Education for Einstein was not the rote transmission of information, but the immunological training of the mind, teaching it to resist infection by propaganda, to tolerate the ambiguity of unsolved problems, to find solace in questioning rather than in the false comfort of absolute answers. It was the slow, unglamorous work of building cognitive resilience, person by person. The montage ends. The last quote, "The important thing is not to stop questioning," lingers over a final, quiet image, a young student, alone in a library, frowning in concentration over a dense text. The surrounding discord is absent here. This is the antithesis of the herd, the deliberate, solitary engagement with complexity. In this image lies Einstein's enduring argument. He mapped the pattern of collapse not to engender despair, but to provide a blueprint for resistance. Recognizing the pattern in history, in others, and in ourselves is the first, essential step in interrupting its sequence. The solution he proposed was not a grand political fix, but a perpetual personal commitment, the relentless, humble application of reason, the courageous maintenance of one's own inner commons of curiosity and skepticism. He left no prophecy of doom, only a pattern of peril, and the quiet, unwavering suggestion that the only way to break the cycle is to think clearly and independently through the storm. The film reel of history runs out, the projector's light dims, and what remains is not a final image but a quiet echo. It lingers in the space between the archival footage and the contemporary glare. Resonance felt more than heard. The observer, Einstein, has long since departed the frame, yet his presence persists in the very questions he framed, in the patterns he traced with such sorrowful clarity. We are left not with him, but with the world he helped us see, a world whose turbulent systems he decoded, whose recurrent fevers he diagnosed, leaving the prescription incomplete. The final scene returns to the essence of the man, not the iconic genius, but the thoughtful witness, his eyes holding a universe of concern, his silence more articulate than any manifesto. He sits in memory by a window, the chaos of his era a muffled roar beyond the glass. His gaze is turned inward, measuring the distance between human potential and human folly. This is the posture he bequeaths, not one of answer, but of profound, attentive question. The warning he issued across decades was never a sealed prophecy delivered with finality. It was an open equation, its variables filled by each generation's choices. He mapped the mechanics of descent, the herd's pull, the tool's sharp edge, the common's erosion, but he stopped short of plotting the course of ascent. That graph, he implied, must be drawn by us, its coordinates determined by our collective courage to think. To recognize the pattern is, therefore, the first and most critical step toward breaking it. It is the moment of lucidity in the fevered dream, the sudden, unsettling awareness of the rhythm to which one has been marching. Einstein's work provides that mirror, reflecting back not our faces, but the structural forces that shape our thoughts and herd our instincts. Seeing the pattern in the 1930s rallies and the digital mobs, in the atomic fear and the algorithmic fragmentation, is to understand that these are not isolated crises, but symptoms of a recurring condition. This recognition is itself an act of resistance, a reassertion of the observer within the observed, the individual mind re-engaging with the system that seeks to subsume it. Yet the film offers no triumphant third-act solution, no montage of reconciliation and rebuilt institutions. It resists the satisfying click of a resolved narrative. Instead, it concludes by holding the weight of Einstein's quiet warnings in the air, an unresolved chord. It ends with a question posed not by a narrator, but by the accumulated silence after his final words fade. The question is implicit in every juxtaposition, every parallel drawn. Having seen the pattern, what will we do? Will we mistake connectivity for community, algorithm for authority, tribal certainty for truth? Will we allow the commons to become a ghost town, or will we labor, patient and stubborn, to replant its shared ground? The echo fades into the ambient noise of our present, the chatter of pundits, the stream of content, the din of polarized crowds. But its frequency remains, a subtle vibration for those who choose to listen. It is the echo of a mind that believed in reason not as a cold mechanic but as a moral compass, in education not as a credential but as a vaccine against the herd's contagion. The final frame is empty, a held shot on a window like his own, through which the light of a troubled world still streams. The responsibility for the next scene, the quiet echo insists, belongs entirely to us. The observer has done his part, the pattern is revealed. The action, the choice to heed or ignore the recurring algorithm of our own unraveling, now lies in our hands, in the quiet of our own thought.